To that, I do want to say a big thank you to NAMI, who is our presenting sponsor for Parent Up Pittsburgh. We really couldn't do it without them, and we certainly appreciate their support. Joining us tonight for our topic, Prepare by Knowing the Facts, Teens, Tweens, Substance Use, and Opioids, is Dr. Susan Tarasevich. Did I say that correctly?
You did.
Excellent. Susan is committed to lifelong learning and brings skills from science teaching, counseling, and school administration to her current work as a preventionist with UPMC-Western Psychiatric Hospital Addiction Medicine Services. She is the lead trainer for the Pennsylvania approved student assistance training with significant experience in online learning. And for over 25 years, she's empowered thousands of school and agency professionals with a background, understanding, and skills to make positive changes in the lives of students and families. She is frequently sought presenter on topics related to adolescent brain-friendly education, educator self-care, trauma-sensitive school practices, and multi-tiered systems of support. She has a doctorate in educational leadership from the University of Pittsburgh, a master's of science in school counseling from Duquesne, and a bachelor's in biology from Seton Hill University. Susan has also co-authored 2 books, Promoting Child and Adolescent Mental Health and Caring in Times of Crisis. Also joining us is Aubrey Stull, who is a clinician, a behavioral health therapist with the Center for Psychiatric and Chemical Dependency Services, outpatient adolescent treatment program in addiction medicine services at UPMC-Western Psychiatric Hospital. So thank you both so much for being here. This is a really important topic now more than ever, and we're really glad to have your expertise. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Okay. We have some things to say, certainly, but we do encourage, if you have any questions during or after this session, don't hesitate to email us, and you see our email addresses on the screen, and we'll be happy to, field the question. If we know the answer, we'll certainly share it. If not, we'll find it for you. So thank you so much. In our next slide, and actually the next 2 slides, we're going to focus on 5 things tonight. The first thing is really talking about addiction and what do we know about the brain and its reaction to substances and behaviors. Also, it's important to know what the risks are, particularly around early adolescent substance misuse, because it tends to have a more intensive effect because early adolescent brain development, the brain is very malleable, it's going through many changes, and so the wiring there, they have a higher risk of perhaps developing an addiction later in life. But we're also going to talk about how do we protect them. In our next slide, we'll talk, or in our next item, the 4th fact is for Aubrey to actually go through the current trends that she and her colleagues are seeing at our intensive outpatient treatment center, and then talk about some strategies. What do we do? Not only what do we look for, but how do we respond? So that's our agenda for tonight. And so let's jump in. We wanted to start with the good news. And the good news is this: the most recent national survey that comes out of the University of Michigan, it's called Monitoring the Future, or as you see at the bottom, MTF. The Monitoring of the Future study has been done over the last 20 years. It's done every other year. And the good news, and something to put in your toolkit in talking with your kids, is that most kids are not using substances to get high. Many times when we talk to adolescents who are not having issues, they tell us they tried it because they were curious, or they wanted to have a good time, or they wanted to fit in. And when kids begin to trust that high and use that substance to feel better, or when we start to talk and really explore that. But as you look at this is a study that actually asks students in 8th grade, 10th grade, and 12th grade, have you ever tried alcohol? And so obviously that's our lowest percentage, but close to half of kids haven't. And certainly as one gets older, 8th graders are going to be less likely to have tried it as opposed to seniors in high school. But when you look at the next three, 75% have never tried marijuana, 75% have never tried a cigarette, and 99% have never tried heroin. So this is going towards social norm theory. No, not everybody's using. And so it's in your arsenal to be able to help kids see that, in fact, it may be that we think we need to do this to fit in, but in fact, we do not. Next slide. So as you click, you see on the right a brain scan. This on the first picture, you can see the inside of the brain, which is in the reward pathway, the limbic system. And you see that we have a lot of activity in this central region when we are just doing our thing. But 1 month after cocaine use, and this is dopamine receptors, what we begin to see is a lack of activity. You see how this area has lost its redness, and then 4 months after cocaine use, it's even more striking. So let's get to our definitions, and if you would click, please. We know that addiction is a brain disease. The reality is, if we knew it, we stigmatize that which we do not understand. And the more we are able to look at the brain through various scans, through various kinds of radioactive uptake experiments and so on, the more we beginning to see structure and function are compromised, and what areas actually are low activity, high activity, when there is a problem with substance misuse or even behavioral addictions like video gaming. So you see that it's chronic, and relapse is part of the process. It's characterized by the inability of a person to, despite negative consequences, stop themselves from using. So there's drug seeking, there's a compulsive desire to use that kind of bridges any kind of control. And our takeaway message is that addiction, just like any other disease, is a brain disease. And we see it as a disease because it changes the structure and function of how the brain works. Next slide. We also know that the brain learns, so brains can change for better or worse. These brain changes that occur as a result of substance misuse or behavioral kinds of activities like video gaming or problem gambling lead to self-destructive behaviors. And so while those things can be reversed to an extent, people continue to struggle. So let's look at our next slide, where we look at risk and protective factors. So a risk factor, my family has a risk for heart disease. Now, just because we have risk factors for heart disease doesn't mean I will develop heart disease. A risk factor is something that kind of tips the scale more toward illness or challenge or negative outcomes. Now, in terms of risk factors, I could have a lot of risk factors, but the more protective factors I put in place, the more I'm able to actually balance those. So if you think about a seesaw or a fulcrum, right, we want to put more protective factors to offset the risk, because I can't change my genetics. But what I can change is diet, exercise, taking care of my stress, and so on. So when the literature looks at the risk factors for developing a substance use disorder or later addiction, you can see that that early age of first use is one crucial risk. Not everybody that begins, and typical age of first use is anywhere from 10 to 12. So that age of first use is challenging or risky for the adolescent brain because it's not fully formed yet. And the brain's busy getting rid of things that it no longer needs, that it isn't using, because there's only so much room in that cranium. What's unfortunate is we know from studies that are 20 years old that if we can help kids navigate through that early adolescent period, their risk for developing addiction later in life lowers. We also know that's because we give that brain a chance to mature over time. Hanging with using friends, there's going to be more peer pressure. That makes sense. Family members who model misuse of substances, where it's a thing to, get 2, 3, 4 glasses of wine every night when, family members come home, or we go out for holidays and there's, Uncle who just always seems to be under the influence. Don't forget older siblings who are using also can be a risk factor for our teenagers. Easy access, being able to have access to whatever I want when I want it. And so when you look at what we as adults in the lives of young people can help them with, it is those strong bonds around, look, our job is to keep you safe. And we say this to educators all the time. And one of the ways we keep you safe is by defining what's appropriate in school. And one of the things that schools have are consistent controlled substances policies, where there are specific things. Yes, there's a consequence for getting caught using in school or under the influence or in possession of alcohol, tobacco, other drugs. And yet we also want to offer that helping hand, because the sooner we get kids before they become seriously involved with substances, the better the trajectory for recovery. Kids who are not connected to school, where they don't feel people care about them, or they don't matter there, or education just isn't important, those kids have a lot of risk, especially when you line these up with other things. For whatever reason, poor social skills, and I guess it makes sense if you think about it, poor social skills, how I am able to be in my life and be with other people, be with adults. When I can't do that, very often alcohol, marijuana turns into that social lubricant that helps me in a indirect sort of way form relationships. The last two are really important. We love children, we love adolescents, but we don't have to approve of use. And I will take a huge step here and say that yes, harm reduction. Many parents feel that having parties in their basement where they can control the kids and take their keys and not let them drive, prevents these tragic accidents. And while that is true, we also know about the vulnerability of the teen brain to substances. And some are going to turn out okay, others not so much. And, when kids ask us, why did I develop a problem? How come I got caught? And how come so-and-so can drink and drink and drink and not have any problems and get straight A's, but I can't? And the reason is because what? Brains are different. So as you look at the protective factors on the right, they really are the polar opposite. So while I could have Uncle modeling drunken behavior, that's an opportunity to talk about, there's adults whose brains are not as vulnerable as a teen brain. Teen brains are still developing. Yes, there are ways for adults to use alcohol and things in healthy ways, but for teens, because of where your brain is in development, not so much. The last one I want to talk a little bit about is parent monitoring and support. Support has to be kind and caring. And lots of times when kids mess up, our tendency is to go right to problem solving, right to consequences. When in fact, while that is appropriate perhaps in the moment, you also want to step back and be able to ask some questions around, why did this happen? What did we learn from it? What can we do differently next time? What were the reasons that this happened? And so really being an ally in problem solving is crucial. And we can go to our next slide.
Susan, before you move on, can I just ask a quick question about that? Well, I don't know if it's quick.
Okay.
But are there any either risk factors that are particularly, I guess I'm saying, is there a way are they ranked in any way? Are there risk factors that pose a larger risk over others? And conversely, are there, from the list of protective factors, are there any on that list that seem to offer additional protection, that are sort of the powerhouse protective factors, or the really significant risk factors?
When in answering that question, I want to go to what do we have control and influence over?
Okay.
And so we know that a genetic propensity is going to be a large risk. And we also know that, for example, sons of alcoholic fathers experience the pleasure of alcohol much more intensely than sons of non-alcoholic fathers. So, we don't have control over that, but it does kind of give some more information around the science of this. And I found, as a science teacher for years and years, kids love to learn about their bodies. And so really targeting, I want you to understand the science when they're of a developmental age to do that. So I think that first use is a critical one. It's hard because adolescents believe they're immortal and invincible, and nothing bad will ever happen to them. I guess it's nature's way of helping them leave the nest. And yet at the same time, really giving that message from an early age. I also think the real powerhouse strategies that I see us having some really huge influence on is from an early age, that value and importance of education, of being in school. And when I don't have success, how do I work with my son or daughter's teachers and counselors to negotiate whatever supports are needed in order to find some success? And also, we don't all have to be A students to be successful. What are kinds of extracurricular activities? What's our influence on, perfectionism? Because lots of kids get stuck in, if I'm not perfect, I'm no good. And I don't know, Aubrey, if in your work you see some risk factors being more potent, some protective factors being more potent.
Yeah, actually, Susan, what you just said, I'll piggyback off of, because I notice with a lot of my clients, they have a lack a lack of extracurricular activities, a lack of being involved in some kind of, whether it be a sport, an activity, a club, something like that to occupy their time. A lot of times they were involved, in elementary school with things, and things kind of fell off, but really trying to help them discover what their likes are, what their interests are, what their values are, I think is a huge thing I've noticed as well.
Mhm.
Wow, it's really interesting. Thank you.
It is. It's a great question, Laura. Next slide. And so it's never too early to start prevention, because our attitudes, our values are shaped from a very early age. And and these are just a few risk factors. We could spend all night talking about individual risks that are biological, individual risks that are environmental, individual meaning within the person, and then the environmental risks outside of the person. So there's lots of them, but there's some that we don't have a whole lot of control over. For example, I know a 14-year-old that I worked with whose mother had some serious addiction problems, was in and out of rehab, was in and out of jail, was living in homeless shelters, so much so that she lost her parental rights. And this young woman was so full of anger and hopelessness that school didn't matter, and nothing really mattered. And so we got her to appropriate trauma treatment. We got her family and family therapy. We did that as soon as possible, but she's always going to have a temperament that she's going to have to learn to manage. And the way we dealt with that was, we all have big feelings, but, there's ways to manage those. Certainly at 14, that was a real challenge for her. And she really didn't start to get it until somewhere around like the middle of her junior year in high school. And then things changed. Things suddenly became important. She began to see that she could have a life, and all of the work that had been done with early treatment had really, and medication certainly was helpful for her, it really made a difference. So the sooner we can get kids with multiple risk factors the help that they need, the better we can reshape their trajectory. Next slide. So how to talk to kids so they'll listen to us. I have a link here at the bottom of the page, which is prevention tips for every age. And we just have the three biggest things are, when we're talking with our kids, just ordinarily using the moments of every day, teachable moments, as opportunities to talk about. With preschoolers, it's really important to take care of our bodies. You build on that from K to 3 in that, sometimes when we're sick, the doctor gives us a medication that makes us feel better. And, that's specifically for you, but it's not what's in the medicine cabinet that's specific, for mom or for dad or for older brother. And then in 4th and 6th grade, we begin to talk about the brain and science. 7 through 9, the same thing, and begin that decisional analysis of, you're always going to have choices to use or not to use. What are the pros? What are the cons of both? So that by 10th and through 12th grade, when they really are confronted with use, and we do want to keep kids from getting into harm's way, you call me, you had too much to drink and you need picked up, no questions asked. I come get you, we go home, you go to bed. However, there are moments then to process that. What happened? How can we keep that from happening next time? However, all of this coming from love and kindness, even when we have to have the tough talks, really depends on us as the adults in their lives being regulated first. So yelling and screaming and ranting and raving doesn't get through, nor do scare tactics. Remember, this is your brain, this is drugs, this is your brain on drugs. Any questions? If that had worked, we would have done away with substance use disorders. It didn't work. So scare tactics are the last thing we want to do. Scaring the hell out of them doesn't work, because then they find out that in fact bad things didn't happen the first time they used, and we must have been not telling the truth. So we have to be calm. We have to be regulated before we can help them. Looking for those teachable moments, though, is critical. Next slide. So 10 tips, just very quickly. And again, it's reiterating what we've woven together so far. Not making light of substance use or laughing at people. You know, right now I'm watching Dope Sick on Netflix or Hulu, one of them. And it breaks my heart to see how this is transforming people's lives in negative ways. Kids have a lot of misperceptions. They think it can't happen to them. They think that once or twice is not a problem. And that we don't know, because brains are different. Keep your family norms in place, consistent rules and boundaries. And remember, good boundaries make space for all of the positive things in life to keep happening. So asking before telling, listening, then asking, can I tell you what I see? Do you want to know what I think? Especially with adolescents. Find them doing positive things whenever you can and reinforce that. They might do 27 negative things, but find at least 4 or 5 great things that they did today, or that you're aware of that are good parts of them, to every negative thing. And you know, this number 8 is probably my favorite one. And in professional development that I do with educators, I say all the time, we're messengers of hope. We're messengers of possibility, that recovery is possible, that there's a lot of hope and a lot of help out here if we just reach for it. And while it might not be the perfect fit the first time, we're not going to give up trying to find the best connection, because you don't have to keep hurting like this. Next slide. Aubrey, you're up.
So thanks, Susan, for saying all of those things. I might reiterate a few things that she said throughout my talking points as well, but that just means they're very important. So before we even kind of get into that, I'm going to kind of go through a couple of different types of trends we're noticing in teen substance use. Just specifically, this is my experience. This is our clinic's experience. I didn't reach out to any other providers in Pittsburgh. So this is strictly just going off of the Center for Psychiatric and Chemical Dependency Services. So probably most prevalent thing that I see are vapes and jewels. A lot of kids get referred to our program by school after they are caught using in school and have to complete a program in order to fulfill their like suspension requirements and to get back enrolled. So with vapes, I always like to mention, like, they can be so tricky because they really can look like a USB port or a little, you never even know at this point. We have things, I'm sure you guys are familiar with, like the Joel pods, which are like the long, skinny black ones. But we also have different kind of like flatter, more rectangular looking ones that almost look like a portable phone charger. So kind of just being aware of, like, if you see, you know, your child or a kid with one of these things, just saying like, hey, what is that? Again, not being pressuring, not being too nosy about it, just kind of inquiring about that. I will say though, with the kids that I do get, typically they're pretty motivated to want to stop using their vapes. A lot of times they will notice that their chest is feeling tight, or that it's harder for them to breathe when they're in gym class, or if they do play a sport, they do notice these things. And a lot of times they'll be able to sit back and say, wow, I bet that's because I'm juuling a lot. And I've noticed it does seem to be a trend that friend groups will often try to like stop together, which is honestly kind of a great thing. Using each other as supports. They'll buy each other. I have a client right now that her friend use those like Dum Dum lollipops that you get at like the bank. You can buy a huge bag of those, for pretty cheap, and they'll use those with each other throughout school to, make sure we're not juuling and things like that. So that's definitely a huge one. Another increase in substance use that I've seen are these THC carts. So the marijuana carts. So if you guys aren't familiar, I have two kind of little pictures listed of what the little carts look like. These are very specific looking. They often do look exactly like this. THC carts are relatively new to the world of marijuana. With states legalizing different things, everyone kind of at this point has different rules, right? We have some where it's legal recreationally and medically, some where it's just medical, and some states where you can't use it all. So these different things it's tough. They're not regulated. So in marijuana carts, you might get a cart that's 90% THC, which is very, very strong, very, very potent. And what I think is getting missed with these kids is they're not understanding how different that is than, say, just like smoking a joint. I'm not saying either one is okay, but I'm saying very different. And with these THC carts, there's not a lot, we don't have a lot of information yet. We don't have a lot of statistics and research on what this does to our brains. So that in and of itself is a little frightening. So if you do notice these cards kind of having these conversations, hey, where did you get this? Did you get it off the street? Did somebody get this at a dispensary? Because that is quite a possibility. You can get these at medical dispensaries all over the city. So really trying to figure out where they got it. Obviously, if it's coming from a dispensary, it's a little bit safer than when we're getting it off the street. Again, I'm not saying either one is okay, but when it is a medical thing, it's a little bit more regulated. With the increase in THC carts, we've noticed that we're getting a lot of teens and adolescents coming in with substance-induced psychosis and substance-induced mania. So basically what that means is somebody with bipolar disorder, right? It can often be a genetic thing. So at some point in their life, they're going to experience a manic episode, and that's going to kind of notify us that, okay, this person, you likely have bipolar disorder. We can get on meds. We can maintain this. We can manage this. But with substance-induced mania, they literally smoke themselves into a manic episode. And I have seen this a few times, and it's very difficult to work with. It's very difficult to watch a kid go through this. I had a 17-year-old boy that was smoking all day, every day, THC carts from the minute he woke up till the minute he fell asleep. And he smoked himself into a manic episode, and it was enough that it scared him. It was a very scary experience. He had the racing thoughts. He did not stop talking. It was excessive talking, very irritable. Grades were dropping. There was just a lot going on. And he finally came to the conclusion that, okay, it has to be this, right? That's the only kind of explanation. And he did stop, and he has not had a manic episode since. So it is possible to induce these types of things. And same with psychosis. Psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, things like that are fairly rare, but we're seeing an increase in audio hallucinations, visual hallucinations, pretty scary stuff for kids to experience. And they often end up in the emergency room of Western Psych when they are having these type of experiences, because it is so scary. So that's just something to kind of keep an eye on. If you want to go to the next slide, I have a few more. Obviously, alcohol is always going to be something that's present. It's legal in this country. It's here. So one thing I think I've noticed is the increase in alcoholic seltzers. I think we all probably know this. We all go to the grocery store. We see these things. We see these commercials. They're everywhere. Seltzers are oversaturating the market, and they can be tricky to spot because sometimes they look just like a regular seltzer, right? If anybody's familiar with like LaCroix or Bubbly or Aha or any of those, like they're very colorful, have very like loud branding. Most of these are labeled as hard seltzers, but are you really seeing the can that well enough that you can read that? So being aware of kind of what they're drinking. The other thing I've noticed is because alcohol is so accessible, by that I mean now we sell it in gas stations, we sell it in grocery stores, it's everywhere to be found. It's a lot easier for them to get a hold of it, right? Most kids don't walk into a beer distributor and try to buy a case of seltzers, but kids will go into Sheetz and they will sneak a seltzer in their bag. It happens a lot. So being really mindful of that. And a huge one, prescription painkillers. I have recently seen an increase in, honestly, a lot of rural areas. We get referrals from all over kind of Western Pennsylvania because a lot of our services are still done virtually. So which is a nice thing that we can see people in rural counties. Washington County, I have a few kids using prescription painkillers, Butler County, up in those more rural areas. Obviously it goes in on, it happens in Allegheny County as well. I'm just noticing that too. And a lot of times they're going into parents' medicine cabinets. They're getting a hold of friends' parents' medications or friends' medications. I've seen an increase in benzos. Xanax in particular is a big one. They call them Xanny bars. Xanax is a big one. Percocet is a huge one. Oxy isn't, I haven't noticed Oxy being as big of an issue as Percocets. Vicodin as well. Best thing to do with prescription painkillers, if you do not need them, there are plenty of ways to get rid of them correctly. You can take them, I'm pretty sure you can take them to any pharmacy at all will take back those drugs. Police station, they're not going to ask you any questions. They want that stuff off the street just as much as we do. So they're not going to ask questions. They're going to take it and they're going to be, thankful that you came forward with that. But kind of with prescription painkillers, as we often know, and if you haven't watched Dope Sick on Hulu, it is a very, very tough watch. I just watched episode 5 last night and had to take a break after it. But it is very enlightening. It is very insightful. I do recommend it. But if you want to go to the next slide, the dangers of prescription painkillers is that they often lead to opioid use. Some signs of teen opioid use include making poor decisions, engaging in risky behaviors, suddenly getting into trouble at school with authority figures. A big one is changing social circles, right? They might become really secretive about new friends they're hanging out with. Maybe you notice they completely cut off their old friend group or distance themselves from their soccer team or their math club, whatever it is. And now all of a sudden they have this new circle of friends. That can be a red flag. Excessive mood swings, not connected to obvious social or environmental factors. Changing grades, loss of interest in school. Out of character aggression with family and friends that is centered around secretive actions. This is a big one, right? We know that keeping up with prescription use and opioid use is expensive. It's not a cheap thing. So oftentimes they have to resort to very secretive actions. This is when I've seen kids get into parents' wallet, take a credit card, take jewelry, anything that they can to get money to pay for this habit because it can become so expensive. Obviously, biggest, most important thing here is recognizing medication missing from medicine cabinets. That is hands down the biggest sign of teen opioid use. Like I said, stealing money or other valuable items to pawn for cash. And I have seen this happen where parents will find needles, cotton swabs, burnt spoons, tinfoil, things that would indicate very serious drug use. Some of the facts or some of the statistics surrounding opioid use, 50% of high school seniors do not think it's harmful to try cocaine or crack cocaine once or twice. And I will say, I hear that a lot from my clients. I hear it a lot from the teens that they think, oh, why can't I just try everything once? And we really have to sit down and explain to them, kind of like what Susan was saying, they really do like to hear the science behind things. They're very receptive to that. I come from a neuroscience background. I studied neuroscience in my bachelor's degree. So I will pull up slides of brain structure and I'll explain to them how their brain's developing. And they do find it very interesting. And a lot of times it can be very eye-opening. 40% of high school seniors believe it's not harmful to try heroin, right? They're in that stage of development where they're curious and they want to try these things and they don't think that there are consequences to their actions. And developmentally, that's how teens are. That's a normal stage of development. So we have to be very aware of that and make sure we're doing all of this kind of preventative action like we're speaking about tonight. 60% of teens that abuse prescription drugs access drugs from or through friends and relatives, right? They don't usually buy this stuff off the street. It's usually right under our noses. Okay, do you want to move to the next one?
Can I ask, do you see among your patients a particular sort of gateway drug that is more likely to lead to opioids? Is it access to prescriptions, and so then they're sort of jumping right kind of to that? Is it alcohol use? Is it marijuana use? Is there some, or is it just every kid is different and so you just can't tell?
You know, honestly, every kid is so different. It's so hard to gauge that, because I have some that, that only smoke marijuana, and marijuana is their main, they have no interest in anything else. That is their main substance of choice. They're like, nope, this is all I want to do. This is good enough for me. And that's something. But then I see other teens coming in that overdosed, that were at Children's, that were actively using heroin.
Mm-hmm.
Another kind of scary thing to kind of point out here, and we don't want to go with the scare tactics. Susan is 1,000% right with that. Mm-hmm. But we have to be aware that fentanyl is a huge problem mm-hmm. in our region. In the whole country, but specifically here in our region. Mm-hmm. And when they're getting these things, they don't know what's in it, and oftentimes when they have an overdose, they'll go to Children's usually to be managed medically, and then, are referred out from there. Mm-hmm. And 9 times out of 10, they didn't have any idea, what they were using, especially with cocaine right now. Fentanyl is really, California is having a huge issue. I think I just saw a statistic. It was like 8% of people using cocaine or overdosing, on fentanyl. And cocaine's not something it's not a common thing to overdose on. So it's very scary, and really trying to get that across to them without coming off to be scary, mm-hmm. But also making sure they know that fentanyl is nothing to not take seriously, mm-hmm.
Is cocaine readily available? Because I know when I was like in the 90s, the late 90s and early 2000s, when I was doing a lot of child advocacy and was working with a lot of parents, and we were seeing addiction issues, mm-hmm. It was cocaine or crack were mm-hmm. sort of the more prevalent drugs being abused. And then within, 5 to 10 years, we would hear much more about heroin. Is there a trend in that direction, or is it just whatever is accessible for kids in school because they're going to access what they can?
It's kind of that way. It's more so what's accessible. I would say more cocaine use occurs in the more wealthy, like, suburbs of Pittsburgh.
Okay.
Some of like the northern suburbs, Pine Richland area, North Allegheny, even down into the South Hills, like Peters Township, Upper St. Clair, just areas that it is typically socioeconomically a little bit more of a readily available thing versus in lower income areas.
Okay.
I would say that's the biggest thing I noticed.
Okay.
Yeah. You guys have any other questions?
I think
Okay.
that's-
You can move to
Yeah.
Susan, do you want to speak on this slide? I can too, but
We can share it. You go ahead and start.
so what do we do when we suspect these things, right? What do we do when we find the jewel, when we find the vape, when we find the alcohol cans, or when we suspect it, right? So we want to really pay attention to those physical changes. That could look like, what does their sleep schedule look like? I'll say that's a big one for substance use, is like, are they going to sleep at a good hour? Are they sleeping through the night? Are they waking up on time for school? You know, a lot of times I'll see my teens will stay up till 3 a.m., you know, to smoke weed outside, so their parents don't know about it, and they're not getting sleep and they're not waking up for school. So you'll notice these kind of changes, which then leads into school performance and activity changes. Keeping that open communication with guidance counselor, with teachers. I know it's hard, but definitely having an understanding of where they're at in school is really, really key, especially if we're seeing changes, right? If we have a B student now has straight C's and D's, something's up, right? Something's going on here. Or somebody that was, you know, in 3 honors classes and participating in student council, all of a sudden quit student council and wants to drop all these honors classes. Something's probably going on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Susan.
I was just going to say, when you see major changes and you don't know what's underneath them, and I also think that you also can miss the kids who've been silently suffering for years that have found something that takes that pain away. You know, school hasn't been a successful place for them. They're staying home a lot. No matter what we do, we can't get them to school. It doesn't mean that they're substance using, but something sure is going on. And, you know, now more than ever before, we've got some really good treatment modalities that can put kids on a better track. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, like we said, finding evidence of paraphernalia, right? We kind of have a confirmation of, okay, this is what's presented here.
And there's, if you ever have a chance to, if your school ever does an assembly that's called In Plain Sight, and it's a group of families that have put together a kid's bedroom, and all of the places that they hide things. I didn't know, never went to it, but I've heard it's an eye opener. I didn't know that many times kids will stash drugs where in the battery compartments, let's say of alarm clocks or other battery compartments, you can search online for things that look like, you know, an ordinary water bottle that unscrew at the bottom and you can put things into, or you can put a beer can in. You know, the ways of, you know, you can turn into a master detective and drive yourself crazy looking for stash. But the real rubber meets the road when you start to see, you know, hygiene is deteriorating and they haven't bathed for 3 days and they're not eating, or they're eating nothing but junk. Those are the times to really start to ask the questions. Next slide. So, you know, this is just a reiteration of, you know, we start with care and concern. We talk about, this is what I'm seeing. Don't be surprised if you get, you know, a $5 million reaction to that, either with tears or anger or whatever, but stand in your truth. And it isn't about accusing. It's about trying to stop progression. And just want to mention, every school has a student assistance program. And the better part of my professional career has been professionally training educators on what signs to look for. Because very often, you know, classroom teachers, they see kids every day at the same time, and they're in a position to detect small changes sooner. One of the things that our SAP teams are charged with doing also is providing support during and after treatment so that we can provide support. We need to move forward and figure out how to recognize we're all on the same side, and that's the students, that's the child's. So the SAP team at a school, we have them K to 12, and you know, really do find them to be a frontline support for families. And you as a family member can, you know, call the school counselor and say, you know, I heard about this SAP program and I've been worried about my kid. And it doesn't even have to be around substances. It could be, I had a dad refer his son because the child was playing, what is it, Minecraft, from the time he got home to the time he went to bed at 3 a.m. And then he had a hard time getting up for school. So you get the cycle. And so one of the things was the kid just happened to be caught vaping in school. And the dad said to the principal, please take his gaming apparatus away. Take it away for a month. And, you know, the parents called him within, I think, a week and said, you know, we have our son back. So, you know, we can become brain dependent on behaviors. And the two that have enough evidence to be considered active addictions, problem gambling and video gaming. Not so much in the United States, but the World Health Organization in 2018 did say, yep, it's a behavior addiction. Next slide.
So I'm just going to talk about a few more kind of strategies for parents, guardians, family members. And I operate from a dual diagnosis perspective. That's what I work in, which basically means that the clients that I see have a mental health diagnosis as well as a substance use disorder. And I would say for teens, most of the time that's the case, right? Most of the time there's also some underlying like anxiety, whether it be social anxiety or generalized anxiety or depression. ADHD is a big one. A lot of kids I see with ADHD have co-occurring substance use disorders. So
Aubrey, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but it's when we were talking about the risk factors, a pre-existing diagnosed mental health diagnosis was not necessarily listed as a pre-existing or as a risk factor. Is that something that parents should be thinking about if they have a child with ADHD? Or I'm thinking especially, you know, some of this, when we were talking about the social interaction with anxiety and using substance abuse, using substances to help with some of that maybe social awkwardness. Is it a pre-existing or not pre-existing? Is it a risk factor, or is it just sort of some of the behaviors or circumstances that could be described as both the mental health and as a risk of substance abuse? I asked that really badly. I'm sorry.
No. I see what you're saying. I think it's more the latter. I think it can be a risk factor. Absolutely. I don't think that every kid with ADHD then develops a substance use disorder, but it is something that parents should be aware of with anxiety and depression. You know, I think specifically is like, what are their coping skills, right? How are they coping with that depression and that anxiety? And, you know, kind of having that discussion more so around using substances as coping. right?
Right.
People, turn to alcohol when they feel sad. And what is that really doing? And kind of having that open discussion of like, well, alcohol is a depressant. So if we're already feeling really terrible and really depressed and low mood and low energy, adding that depressant to us isn't going to make us feel better, maybe temporarily in that moment. But even so, afterward, I talk about the booze blues a lot with the kids. I'm very open and honest with them about that. We talk about that a lot, how oftentimes you'll wake up with anxiety or the booze blues and you feel a lot worse. So I don't necessarily know that it's a direct risk factor, but it's something to very much be aware of. If your kid is diagnosed with depression, anxiety, anything like that, just something to keep in the back of your mind. It doesn't always mean that it'll develop into that.
Right. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So some more strategies in parents, for parents and guardians and family members. First things first, you got to know what's going on in your teen's life. One of the things Susan mentioned was that teachers will often start to pick up on these things, and teachers see them every day in a very structured setting. So it's kind of easy to do that. But, as parents and family members, we're busy. We're busy. We have our own lives. We're trying to run a household. There might be other kids in the house, other responsibilities, work. We have full plates, but really taking the time to know what's going on in your teen's life is hands down the biggest thing. And you can have open discussions about that, open dialogue. Talk about a curfew, talk about that early when they're like 13, 14, that's their curfew at that age is going to look a lot different than, maybe when they're 16 and 17, and kind of start to throw that idea out there. Be really conversational about it. Ask them what they think. Ask them what they want, right? That doesn't mean we have to give in to every demand that they have, but the biggest thing I get from kids is like, my parents don't listen to me. They don't hear what I have to say. They don't validate me. They don't think my problems are real. Right. And that happens a lot, as we get older, our problems change, right? We're more worried about, paying our mortgage and taking the dog to the vet and, making sure there's dinner on the table tonight. Where in kids' realities, their biggest stressors are what's going on at school, what's going on with their friends, what's going on in their life. And we have to put ourselves in their reality and understand that that's everything to them. So we don't want to invalidate. We really want to make sure that we're very open about this stuff.
I think that's really interesting, because I think I know among my peer group, my middle-aged peer group, we often say you couldn't pay us enough money in the world to go back to high school, right? I mean, it's, and I've been out of high school a really good long time, and it still is not something I want to revisit. So it's interesting that then, sometimes we forget that reality, that even now we're adults with coping skills and means and autonomy. And the thought of going back to high school or running into someone from high school sometimes is just, and
Yes.
so I think that's really interesting. Aubrey, let me ask you if, in kind of particularly, I guess, for teens more so than the early intervention, how do you advise, parents and caregivers to balance a need for privacy and sort of understanding that your teen is kind of developing their own personality. They want some privacy, they want some autonomy. And yet also, even when they're not maybe so willing to open up, how do you approach that? And is there a point at which you say, okay, this is sort of the big red flag. I need to get some outside support, whether it's student assistance, whether it's an outside professional, kind of how do you walk parents through that thought process?
So that is a hard thing. And that's probably what parents struggle with the most is balancing the support and the independence, right? And trying to find that middle ground. And what it really is trying to talk together of what that middle ground is, explaining to them like, hey, listen, I understand you're going to try things, experiment with things, part of being a kid and developmentally, they're going to rebel a little bit, we have to understand that a piece of that is normal. What is not normal and where we need to step in with that extra that extra support is when we see those grades declining, the activities stopping, the friends changing, all of those. When we notice those things, we're going to have to sit down with them and say, hey, I'm noticing that, you know, your grades are a lot lower right now, and you're not hanging out with your best friend, Amy, that you've spent every day for the last 8 years with. Like, what's up with that? Do you want to talk about it? If you don't want to talk about it with me, can we go see your guidance? Can you go talk to your guidance counselor? Can we talk to your therapist? You know, and kind of giving them options. You know, a lot of times parents come in with this stern foot, and that's really hard to do with kids. They're not very receptive to that. They're gonna fight you back on it. So opening the conversation, again, hearing them and their perspective, they might not have any idea what they want, and they might need that extra support of you throwing some ideas out there, like, hey, why don't we think about going to look for a therapist, so you have somebody to talk to that's not just me. You know, I know I'm mom, and it can be uncomfortable to like tell me some of these things, but would you be willing to talk to a therapist about it, and somebody who, you know, can help to support you through that?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. One of the other things that you had kind of sparked in my head about, you know, going back to high school, we all do kind of dread that idea, thought of, oh, we can never go back to high school.
Yeah.
But now we also have this entire new world of like social media, right? On top of just being a regular kid and all the stressors they have. Now we have this added pressure, this added stressor, and we can't forget that. We have to remember that that's a piece of their life. And the fact that now everything is in our hands, right? Before, you know, even when I was I'm not that old, but when I was in high school, you know, I would come home and I'd have to call my friends, like, you know, on the phone, or log on to AOL, you know, and like, and it wasn't as accessible to like have conversation constantly. So when we open that world of having conversations with our friends and these people at school constantly, they never get that time to shut off. You know, so with that, it could look like setting boundaries with, you know, even phone stuff. You know, I always encourage my clients to use like the screen time part of your phone. I have an iPhone, so mine's really easy to find, and you can actually go in and limit like how much time you want to spend on Instagram, on TikTok, on Facebook, on all these platforms, so that, you know, we are getting that time to shut down and talking to them why that's so important. I know that's a little off topic of substance use, but truly it all plays a role. Next, on open and consistent communication.
Oh, Aubrey, you're muted accidentally, I think.
Whoops.
There you go.
Whoopsies. Open and consistent communication. Again, this is so huge. We've talked a lot tonight about talking early and often with your preteen, with your teen. Again, know these facts, right? Know this kind of stuff. Do some like due diligence and some research. If you just Google teen substance use, man, you're going to get a whole plethora of helpful websites. So use that to your advantage. You know, also part of having this technology at our fingertips is the fact that we can Google things like that and Google, okay, what are some symptoms of like marijuana use? You know, Susan mentioned, do they have the munchies? Do you notice they're eating a whole bag of Doritos at 10 o'clock at night? You know, when we notice these things, we can become more aware. Again, I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but listen to what your teen has to say. Try so hard not to interrupt, right? Try to just be there. Let them know that you are a supportive person that they can reach out to. Like I said, make it conversational. Emphasize short-term risks. That's a big one because their brains are not developed in a way. Their prefrontal cortex in the front of their brain that is where all their decision making comes from, that's not developed yet. So they don't have quite as much of the capability of seeing those long-term effects as you and I do, right? Some of them might be able to, especially if they have like long-term goals and we can really hone in on that. Oh, you want to go to nursing school someday? That's awesome. That's great. That's really hard to do if we're using substances, you know, and you can hone in onto that. But otherwise, make it short term. You know, if you get caught in school vaping, you're not going to go to prom. They're not going to let you go to prom. They're not going to let you be in the student play. You'll have to miss your football games, right? Things that matter to them right now in the moment, try to focus on those. And explore ways to manage peer pressure. You know, that I will say, I have noticed not a lot of teens tell me they get pressured into it. Peer pressure seems to be going down. It seems to be more of the curiosity around using and wanting to try, and less pressure to do it. Like, I have a lot of teens right now that still go to parties every weekend and come back to me and report no substance use. You know, they call themselves like the babysitters now, or they'll call themselves being the mom of the group. You know, it's not, I do notice that has gone down, probably since even I was a kid.
Are you seeing the impacts of COVID and kids being out of school or isolated? And I guess what I'm curious about is, are you seeing any trends is there sort of an uptick in substance use or abuse after sort of coming out of isolation, or, you know, and now around friends and dealing with such a change in environment maybe, versus, or was it more prevalent when they were isolated at home? Yeah.
So I personally think it was more prevalent when they were isolated at home, but then it obviously carried over into like them going back to school, trying to get back to this like new normal. But I think, you know, when people were locked away for a long time, it was, you know, on one hand, it's harder for them to get access to things. You know, it really was. They couldn't just go to school and get this stuff. So that kind of played a role, but also like the increase in depression and anxiety, social anxiety, all of that stuff, it definitely did play a role. And I will say a lot of my clients, no, I probably have a mixture of both. I have some that are still virtual, that are like PA, like cyber, things like that, charter school, stuff like that, and in person. I probably have a 50-50 mix of both.
Okay.
Well, and the mental health and treatment systems are just deluged right now. And that's a couple reasons. There's such a need. But on the other hand, you know, people are leaving fields like education and therapy because it's way too stressful.
Yeah.
Yeah, we know that very well here.
Yeah.
We've seen that too. Certainly as kids started going back to school and families started kind of coming out of their own lockdown or isolation, we were getting we continue to get referrals for mental health, but it's tough. It was a tough couple, 18 months, 2 years for our staff as well. So we understand that completely.
Yeah, absolutely. So setting boundaries together, right? We want to set expectations, set consequences together, work together, be consistent, seek support. So set the rules before your teen is exposed to a situation, right? Okay, here's what's going to happen. If you do this stuff, if you do get caught at school, these are going to be the consequences. Let's talk about them together. Make sure that they're appropriate consequences. That's an interesting thing. Sometimes parents will come up with these really extreme consequences. I have a teen right now that hasn't had a phone in 10 months, and it is just making her life and mine, because I can't get a hold of her ever. It's very complicated, and we're trying to kind of switch gears, right? So instead of, oh, hey, the more you do this, the more time you're not going to have your phone. Hey, let's see if you can go 1 week without using marijuana, and then maybe I'll give you your phone back for a week, and we'll go from there, right? Let's earn the privileges instead of taking them away. Because at a certain point, they just stop caring. She doesn't have a phone, and she doesn't care at this point. She uses her other friend's phone. She logs in, she does what she needs to do, and she tries to make it work the best she can, and she just doesn't care. She's not motivated by that. So we have to switch direction. Again, listen to their views, discuss options with them, write out rules in a positive way, right? We talked about optimism and hope. Like, don't make it this end all be all, like really be on the same page. Be consistent. That's really important too. I notice parents, you know, we have a lot of stuff going on. If we're having a bad day, like sometimes we just brush it off. Oh, I can't worry about this right now. I can't deal with them right now. Oh, your dad can deal with it. Oh, your mom can deal with it. You know, that kind of stuff is going to give them very mixed messages. It's going to show them, oh, hey, sometimes I can get away with it. If they're too tired to deal with me, I can get away with this. Right. So be as consistent as you can. Always offer encouragement, you know, even when they do. I think Susan had mentioned at some point, and this is important, relapse is often a normal sign of the stages of change, right? As we worked through the stages of change, there's going to be a relapse. And with that relapse, it's okay. We have to sit and we have to go over, what were we doing? What was going well? What didn't go well? What can we do differently next time? Right? Don't shame, don't guilt. Those are strong emotions, right? That those can fuel some really serious things in them. So the more we shame, the more we guilt, the less likely they're going to be open to coming to us to talk about these things if it were to happen again. And seek support. Honestly, being a parent, I am not a parent myself, but I cannot imagine how difficult that is. And it's okay to need your own help. I always am suggesting parents get their own therapist, their own support systems. Sometimes family is a great support. Sometimes they have great friends. Other times they need that extra step of like getting their own therapist. That way they can work through some of their own kind of stuff. Susan highlighted that we as the adults have to model, which we're going to talk about in a second, but we have to model what we want them to act like. And if our own emotions aren't regulated, they're going to see what we're doing, right? They're going to see our explosive, angry episodes or our frustrating, you know, yelling arguments. So just be very aware of that. And it's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's nothing to feel ashamed about. I am always so excited when a parent's finally like, okay, I got into my own treatment. I'm like, yes, I'm like so excited for them. So 100% suggest that if it comes to it. But being a positive role model and leading by example is huge. You know, it is legal for us to drink. We are allowed to drink. Make sure we're doing it, you know, if we can, keeping it away from them. But if we're doing it in front of them, showing them how we do it responsibly. You know, I think there's probably a lot of research out there comparing us to like European countries, right? Where it's a little bit more normalized to drink, and just drinking is a little different over there, right? It's much more contained. There's not a lot of binge drinking. So making sure we're, you know, leading by example, showing your teen that you can have a good time without using substances. You know, if you're going to go to the bowling alley, think twice about getting that beer before you go bowl with your family. Like, hey, maybe I'll just have a soda tonight. I can show that like things are fun, even though we're not using. Talk about values. One of my favorite groups ever is to lead like a values group with kids. I do a little values auction where I give them Monopoly money and they have a little like bid thing and they bid on their values. And it's a really fun activity. It's a fun way to have that discussion and talk about what are values, where do they come from, and what happens if we start to live our life in a way that isn't lining up with those values, and how do we get back on track? Really be mindful of if you're using to cope with stress, right? You know, long day at the office, you come home, you open the bottle of wine, you drink the whole thing, right? Sitting on the couch with your kid watching TV. They're going to see that and they're going to say, okay, so when I have a stressful day at the office, it's okay if I come home and drink a bottle of wine, you know? So just being really mindful of that. Really having conversations about like glamorizing alcohol and substance use. There's a lot of shows, you know, out there. Some shows I think are doing a good job of kind of showing the dangers of this stuff. Dope Sick being one of them. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with like Euphoria on HBO. That's a big one. That one's a little mixed, but it does highlight the dangers, you know, of using but we also want to see, are they glamorizing that? Are they making it, you know, teen parties and movies look really fun and really crazy? And I've never even been to one of these teen parties, but they look really wild, and, you know, and saying like, you know, this isn't really what it looks like. This isn't really what happens, you know? So again, your teens are watching you, even when you think that they're not, and they're picking up on these behaviors and they're making it their own. So just be really mindful, of your own kind of personal stuff. And then lastly, build a close and caring relationship. That's the best thing that you can do. Really help them to find their passion, their spark, maybe they just need a little bit of a nudge in a direction, right? Maybe you guys start exercising together and going to the gym. I have a client that loves to go to the gym with his dad. When he goes to the gym with his dad, he's so excited about it. Get them into playing a sport, play with them. Cooking is a great way to spend time together and really instill a lot of good things. Trying to listen to the same music or watching movies or just bringing some togetherness in some way. They're going to be a lot more likely to come to you in times of need and in times where they're struggling if they have this close relationship, with you. Tell them you love them, show them affection. Susan said this earlier, tell them what they're doing good. Oh, that is my biggest tip to parents, is tell them what they're doing good. A lot of times when they're struggling, all they're hearing is, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you can't do this right. And they just beat themselves down, man. And I do a lot of self-esteem work with kids. It's my favorite thing to do, is work with self-esteem. And sometimes it is just so far in the trenches. It's how did you even get down? How is your self-esteem this bad? And a lot of times it does come back to, very specific things parents have said or teachers have said to them that really, they stick, and sometimes we refer to these as negative core beliefs. And these deeply rooted beliefs have a long lasting impact on people in their lives. So really, really be aware of that. And build their confidence. We want them, again, tell them when they're doing things right. Tell them when you notice that they're making these positive changes, even if it's the smallest thing, right? They get through one day without using their Juul. Great job. That's not an easy thing to do, right? I start out with a lot of my sessions by just thanking my clients for being able to make it there that day, because it's not easy to get out of bed and do all the things we need to do. And especially if we have substance use or a mental health diagnosis, it makes it a lot harder. So really just highlighting any positive you can find I'll leave it at that, is my biggest piece of advice. So for some support resources, you can obviously go to the student assistance program. Like Susan said, she's going to have a lot more information about that, but every school has a program. Smart Choices is through Children's, and it is I'm not as familiar with Smart Choices. I get a lot of referrals then from Smart Choices, but it's more of I think a brief intervention. Yeah, a brief intervention. So that's an option. Where I work is the UPMC Center for Psychiatric and Chemical Dependency Services. I run our adolescent outpatient group. It meets on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays for 3 hours. We meet from 4 to 7. So I cut group a little early tonight to join you guys. So we have IOP. We also I run an adolescent outpatient group on Tuesdays. There's just strictly outpatient, and there's also psychiatry services available. Gateway is another good resource in our area. There's a lot of different facilities. I won't sugarcoat this. There is not a lot of substance treatment in Western Pennsylvania. I won't sugarcoat it at all. If they need a higher level of care than IOP, which is an intensive care, but it's not partial. It's not an inpatient facility. It's not residential treatment. That kind of stuff is very hard to find. And unfortunately, we do end up having to look outside our area a little bit. I've had a few clients that have gone to California with, I think it's called Newport. They have some East Coast and West Coast places. Karen is a good one. That's out in Philly. I think there's also one in Ohio, maybe. But but these do sometimes get a little pricey. Sometimes they're privately owned and things like that. So unfortunately, we really need some more resources in our county. And hopefully we're moving toward that. The Pathway to Care and Recovery is one of the newer resources that I've been made aware of. And this offers 24/7, 365 access. I think they'll do like a brief assessment with you, get you connected with somebody, help you find the resources.
You just have to be 14 or over.
Okay. For
And
Pathway.
they also have a mobile unit that will come to you.
Wow.
Which is really
Right.
cool. Yeah, that's huge.
Holy Family has an outpatient one-on-one substance use treatment. Again, you have to be 14 or over, but it's one-on-one. It's once a week, 1 hour. It's called SHORES, SHORES. And we're finding that, they'll come to school with, appropriate consent. And the thing that's really important too is the federal drug and alcohol regulations around confidentiality are pretty important. So much so that if someone were to tell Aubrey in treatment that they were hiding their stash in the artificial ceiling in the gym because in the locker room of the gym because the drug dogs don't hit up there, she couldn't tell anybody. And that's precisely because they want people to be honest and to really begin to peel away that stigma. So, yeah.
And then we have one more page of, this is a bunch of different resources. Al-Anon, family groups are wonderful. If you've never attended, I had a girl over the summer, her and her dad was in recovery. He had been a recovering alcoholic, was sober for about 10 years. And she was struggling, and they would go to meetings together, and it was huge for her recovery. Like, that was one of the most important things, was that they attended those meetings together every week and really kept her consistent. And she's doing really well now. Ally-Teen, much like Alcoholics Anonymous, but for teens, definitely a safer option. I wouldn't necessarily expose them to an AA meeting unless somebody was there to also, they can just get a little intense, probably for developmentally, like for teenagers. Smart Recovery is a great option. Bridge to Hope is a huge one. But all of these resources, again, there's a lot of educational stuff on there. There's a lot of prevention tips, early action, things like that. So really good resources for you guys.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me just check in the chat. I think I was trying to ask some of the questions as they were coming in. I think we got all of them. Aubrey and Susan, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It really, you are both just a wealth of information. And we know that this is something that parents in our area, parents that we work with, and our staff who work with families who are working through substance abuse with teens and young kiddos, and even trying to talk about it when there's a family member who's dealing with addiction. This has just been incredibly helpful. Thank you so much for being here. I want to thank again NAMI, our presenting sponsor, for making this possible. We will be putting this up on our YouTube channel, and hopefully even more people will be able to go online and get that support that you guys have offered. So we can't say thank you enough. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and thanks to everyone for taking the time out to be here and listen and participate in Parent Up. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you guys.